I'm going to start with Nancy, just because I think your organization is more the challenges you face are probably more familiar to most of us in the room. And so you have a title with innovation in it. Now, there didn't used to be titles, senior vice presidents of innovation or chief innovation officers. And so the very fact that you have that role must mean that there's a leadership, there's a need for a point person to make innovation happen in this kind of a large-scale organization. Can you just tell us what's the scope of your responsibility and what kind of staff do you have, and what are you trying to get a handle on there?
The title's a bit misleading because when we started innovation in 1999, the chairman of the company, Dave Whitwam, realized that there were a lot of things we had to break down and change in the system. And so it's a little bit more like an architect of looking at the management systems in the company and re-engineering those so that innovation works. It's very rare to find me on an actual innovation team. I mean, it'd be very hard for me to list the innovations that I've created at Whirlpool. So I work more in the background, if you will, thinking about, for example, we heard an example earlier, budgeting. We started innovation in 1999. We're a very big company, as you mentioned, $19, $20 billion, 100,000 employees by the end of the year, very big. So big budget, we set the budget annually, and in the middle of the year, if you came up with a $10,000 idea that was genius, there was no money for it. So it was a little bit of the discussion we had earlier where we were investing in the old strategy and not the new strategy. So part of what I did and my team and teams around the world would look at the budgeting process, for example, and try to figure out how to make it drive innovation instead of stopping it, looking at talent, looking at training, looking at compensation. The other thing my team does, I have a very small staff, but we have one innovation process around the world, and we train what we call I-mentors. The high water mark, we had about 1,500 I-mentors around the world. These are people that help people that have an idea, teams of people, get them from A to Z, to really get them through ideation into commercialization. So they're like Six Sigma black belts for innovation, and so my team does a lot of that as well.
I mean, it seems like a lot of what you're describing is dealing with the fact that you do have an organization that was built, structured in an industrial age, along an industrial model, and you're really trying to figure out ways around barriers that exist in the old. Is that how you see your role?
That's exactly. I mean, I used to work with a gentleman that some of you maybe know, Samantra Ghoshal, and he said to me, Nancy, a fish, no matter how well sighted, cannot see the water in which he swims. I said it about something else, but it kind of stuck in my head, and I started thinking about organizations swim in a water that is invisible, and in our case, the water is kind of Industrial Revolution era water. And so the question is, how do you take all these invisible things that are really driving behavior, that are really running the company, and not bring the company to its knees by stopping all of them, but begin to reinvent them over time to make innovation work? The only other thing I'll say is sometimes I work for Jeff Fettig, who's now the chairman, and sometimes he changes my title to the vice president of No, That's Not It. Ah. Because a lot of what I do is I'll come up with 3 or 4 or 10 ideas about how to do something. Of course, about 9 of them are dumb and they don't work, and so the title changes a bit.
One thing I like about your background is that you also used to be in charge of the corporate university, the leadership development, I guess, function at the company. And so in terms of innovation, what do you think is teachable? What's being taught there that didn't used to get taught there?
Yeah, I think the important thing about the corporate university that we started was in 1999, we wanted innovation to be a core competence. And again, like the discussion we had earlier, not, if you think about common cause and special cause, like in Six Sigma, we wanted it common cause. We wanted it always on. We wanted it in everyone's job. We wanted it sustained over time. And so the idea that we could actually create a new core competence was a daunting kind of thought. And so at the time we decided to create this corporate university and to create some foundational knowledge about innovation, what our process was like, what the tools were like, why we were doing it, why it was important to our strategy. But most of the innovation work happens in an action learning, in a lab, out in the field with teams. And so a lot of the learning from Whirlpool University was actually out with teams, like being embedded with the team for 6 to 9 months, helping them, as I said earlier, get from A to Z. The only other thing is that the role of leadership changes significantly when you begin to embed innovation. And again, it's not like we want leaders to run and be the innovators. We want leaders to help re-engineer all these systems. Because if you think about changing a budgeting system, for example, in a company our size, that's hard to do as a grassroots effort. You really need people that kind of lead those functions to begin to re-engineer some. So the role of leadership and teaching that and the new traits that we wanted from leaders was very important for Whirlpool University.
Yeah, yesterday you used that great phrase, I even tweeted it, that innovation is like a natural resource in the organization. Everyone has this impulse for creativity and that it's there to be mined. I guess that's the new role of the leader, is to try to mine that, to try to enable it to come to the surface. Before I bring in Marc, I would be crazy if I did not ask you to tell a story of an innovation, a favorite innovation story in the company, and maybe one that's a model for here's how we do innovation when we're at our best.
I'll do 2 quick ones. One, it happened many years ago. Several employees in one of our plants were trained from the innovation process and decided that they would be tailgaters. In the United States, we have all these tailgaters that go to football events. They decided to take a Cadillac Escalade and begin to re-engineer it for tailgating. This was 20 years or 15 years ago when we started. One engineer, 3 or 4 factory floor employees, using the innovation tools and creating this amazing innovation. It didn't quite make it to the market because it turns out they put a grill in the back and it was kind of unsafe. But it was just this burst of energy that was, again, sitting below the surface, and so that was an interesting one. The other one that I like to talk about is in the United States, we have a lot of garages, and we were going through an innovation process when we asked who is our customer, and at Whirlpool we primarily felt our customer were women. And so we used an orthodoxy tool and said, well, what if they were men? What is it in the United States, in this example, that men do around the home? And as it turns out, they spend a lot of time in the garage. So our innovators went out and started taking pictures of garages and trying to figure out kind of what are the innovations that could happen in the garage. So Gladiator Garage Works was invented, a new brand, an amazingly successful, huge brand that we have in the United States that came out of just asking this question, like, what if we turned a concept upside down and did it differently?
Okay, the only man on the panel, would you buy this product?
Sorry?
Well, that's a great brand name. It's a good man name, Gladiator. You know, I think I'm in.
So now let's move to this incredibly innovative space of gaming that you're in. And the thing that is unbelievable about your company is that even though you're in a brand new sector, I mean, where were games 20 years ago? You even have felt like you needed to innovate within that sector with a different kind of, I don't know, value capture strategy. Maybe you can describe that.
Sure. So one of the initial core parts of the thesis, and that's why we ended up founding Riot, was because we believed that the games industry was going to be undergoing a transition and was being disrupted as it was transitioning from a packaged goods-oriented business model to a service-oriented model. And all of the incumbents that had their billions of dollars of market cap and amazing development talent were creating games that were designed to be sold at retail for $60, sort of one optimal price point. And as consumers of games, especially online multiplayer games, my partner and I were quite aware that online gamers were very unhappy that the development team that would create this amazing game that they love would have no incentive to continue to develop the game. Essentially, they would move on because their publishing deal or their internal strategy would say, we need to go develop a new SKU and to make more revenue. And what the gamers really wanted, what the customer really wanted, was just to continue to play their game and get updates and evolve it and work with the developer to improve the experience they already loved. And so we perceived that as a tremendous opportunity. And League of Legends was part of our initial proof point to justify that. And we've been thrilled with the results.
I mean, you unlike Nancy, you've got this complete blank slate that you started with, and you knew you had a business that you were building that would be completely dependent on constant innovation. So I'm wondering, how did you think about the business that you needed to build around? I mean, I'm sure you were very focused on the product that you were building, but the structure of the place, the culture of the place, how have you approached that?
Sure. So that's quite complex. I think that I could give a whole presentation about it, of course, but I think that this conference has highlighted a lot of themes that are really relevant and meaningful for Riot, and that have helped inform a lot of our philosophy about how we've organized the company and why we've done what we've done. And to talk a little bit about some of the challenge, when we launched League of Legends in 2009, we had 60 people at the company. And we had the fortunate problem, though, of creating a lot of value for our players, and so they wanted more. And so we had to grow to keep up with demand. And fast forward to now, Riot has 1,800 people across 15 different offices in many different countries. And and League of Legends is sort of the #1 core game in pretty much every market we operate in. And so one of the sayings that we evolved internally is that we had to build the plane while flying, because we had already launched a product, but it was a service. So just like Facebook or many other web services companies, we had to constantly make improvements to the product while connecting with our audience to understand their needs and evolve in all these different dimensions simultaneously. And of course, that is very difficult. And per Rita's phenomenally telling graph about games on her first slide, the multicolored graph, games are historically a business where leading market positions are fleeting at best. And part of that is because the typical play pattern of a game is it's sort of a linear single-player story-driven game or content where you play through the 20 or 80 hours and you're done. You move on and buy another game for $60. But in the service world, that is very different. We needed to constantly figure out ways to keep our players engaged over a long period of time and deliver value to them. And so one thing that you said that I thought was phenomenal was we were talking about continuous innovation. One element we think is really important for continuous innovation is understanding your audience's expectations. And so one example we could probably all relate to is if we look at the smartphones we all have in our pockets. When these things were launched a couple years ago in 2007 or whatnot, the iPhone came out. It was the most magical device in the history of the universe. And now we probably complain about power consumption and the screen's too small and my texts aren't working, or all of the different, this app sucks, and and these amazing devices now became the expectation very, very quickly. And I think it's really important for companies to understand that phenomenon and to train their employee base to be very connected to the audience you're trying to target, and enable ways to unlock their potential to figure out ways to not only do incremental improvements, but also, of course, transformational improvements, which I think, again, if we sort of charted the various iPhone launches over the last several years, we could come up with Siri and the larger screens and lots of other features which have tried to help them justify, making improvements. And so we've had to do a lot of the same things. And to quickly just articulate a bit of a high-level philosophy in terms of how we think about structuring the organization, we are an agile shop. And we very much believe that agile is not, and the agile philosophy is not solely the premise of software development, but actually can apply to all other forms of the organization as well. Because agile just fundamentally believes that you should organize by the problem and then have cross-functional teams to accomplish that. So one thing that a product team we have internally is a team called Product Riot, which essentially is a cross-functional team of support staff, meaning HR and finance and IT and legal and facilities, et cetera. And one example problem that the Product Riot team, who are serving rioters or prospective rioters, sorry, that's our word for employee internally, is an example of our onboarding team. So our onboarding team would be a cross-functional team made up of some people from IT and finance and HR, et cetera. And their job, the problem that they are responsible for, is helping to onboard rioters effectively. And our onboarding process has gone through hundreds of iterations as we've continued to evolve over time. It's not the siloed IT guy going, I did my job, he had his hardware, and but the facilities guy's like, well, I don't have anywhere to sit, and because they're all part of the same team, and so they can cover for each other to accomplish problems. So we organize that way on the software development side as well. And I could go on and on about some other elements, but I'll let you ask some more questions.
So one thing that I kind of envy about your company right now is you're growing so fast that you need new space. I think in something like 6 years' time, you've gone from, was it 60 employees to 1,700 employees? So now you're creating this new office space. And that's a huge topic. How do you use space to try to encourage creativity, collaboration, innovation? What are your thoughts on that?
So there's probably some great research from all you Harvard researchers in the room, about how to design great facilities and workspaces. We've learned a lot over the years in terms of how our very cross-functional, very design and heavy and/or artistic and engineering teams, very creative teams work, and have informed some of our space design. So we are transitioning from our sort of main headquarters to a 12-acre campus that we're very excited about, and so we've had the opportunity to sort of create it from the ground up and design some cool things. But some of the key elements are, we don't have any offices. So including my partner and I, we are, the top leadership of the company are just as accessible as everybody else. So we are in a pit, and the outside of the office, or sort of the surrounding workspace areas, which are made up of cross-functional teams, tend to be conference rooms or breakout rooms where people can go collaborate together or go whiteboard different problems or whatnot. We also have mobile workstations as well. And so we're structured in a recursive structure, so we have individual teams and then teams of teams, which are then parts of a product and different product groups. And we have found that teams, one of the disadvantages of pit-style open offices is that there's a good amount of noise because people are working and there's buzz and whatnot. We found that the type of noise that is actually distracting to work is noise that is not relevant for the particular team. So people don't mind if your team itself are having conversations. Actually, the engineer wants to hear what the artists or designers are talking about while they're working. Whereas if the team across from them, which is working on a different problem, if they're laughing or doing a bunch of stuff, that can be quite distracting. And so, furniture and workspace design, are intelligently placed to try to minimize some of those types of distractions. But other key elements, of course, is we try to make a space that's very fun and that really, feels creative and is open. And then there's a bunch of amenities that we think are just cool. So we're putting in, we did a deal with one of the top ramen chefs in Japan to go to a sister location that's only in our office, just because that's cool. And our people would think that that's really fun and awesome. And so we have some other cool things like a movie theater and whatever. But those are designed to really engage our employee base in ways that we found oftentimes they have so much fun at work and they love doing what they're doing. Oftentimes they don't leave and they don't want to leave. And that's great, from a lot of perspectives. So.
So we have just a couple of minutes left, and my great innovation as a moderator is that I have decided to outsource the Q&A segment of this to lunch hour, knowing that all four of these very smart people will hang around for lunch, and you can collar them then and get your private consulting engagement. But before we close, can I bring Rita and Nilofer back in just to say, do you have a question for Nancy or Marc that inspired by what they said, or a comment that you would make on how it connects to your work?
I'll start, and I'll ask Nancy. One of the biggest challenges I see in the innovation process is that people tend to have a strong correlation between project risk and career risk. And so, Marc, in your world, you can fail 10 times, as long as it's cheap, or whatever. Right. In your world, you fail 10 times, and it's like, what are you doing? So I'm curious how you overcome that.
Part of it is what we talked about earlier, which is, creating incentives in an environment where everyone can innovate. The other thing is we had this, it was kind of a story that went throughout Whirlpool that if you failed at innovation, something bad would happen to you. And we started asking people, well, give us an example. Who did that happen to? And as it turns out, it wasn't true. And so putting people forward that have been successful or have put ideas forward that maybe didn't work but were still helpful to the organization became really important as role models so that people could see people just like them trying, innovating, some working, some not working. So that's part of how we did it. The other piece is just to embed it in every job. And I think what's important is to put innovation out there in the environment in a way that's useful and allow people to use their own intelligence to figure out how to bring it into their job versus somebody like myself sitting in some central role writing job descriptions for everybody. So if it's out there in the environment and it's accessible and everyone can use it and you have people like iMentors to trust that people are going to be smart enough to figure out how they want to bring it into their job.
Thanks. And Nilofer.
So one of the questions you just raised was the one about, people don't leave work, which I find really interesting, but also kind of scary, especially like when I think about young women who think about maybe they want to have kids and they wonder if that's a good situation for them. How do you build a culture that allows for both?
I think it's a phenomenal question and a really important question, actually. And I think that really relates to having, where it's not about face time, it's about doing the right thing for the audience you're trying to serve and for players and whatnot. And oftentimes, though, in passion-driven organizations and companies, which, gaming is one of the industries which benefits from lots of people who are very motivated intrinsically by the work that they're doing to deliver value to the audience we're trying to serve. They have fun while doing it. When that environment does exist, it can create some peer pressure where it's like, wow, I don't want to be the person leaving at 5 when everyone else is, just getting started, as an example. And so a lot of that actually, I think, does come down to leadership talking about these issues and talking about it being okay and helping to set examples. So one of the things that we've had to do over time is, one, take vacations ourselves and force people to take vacations, force various leaders to take vacations and or go home or things like that because their teams weren't. And so,
because you're a new parent, right? You just shared that when we were in the green room.
Right. I'm a new parent. I have 2 kids, and a 6-week-old girl, little girl, and a 17-month-old boy. And all the Rioters are very happy when I had children, and same with my partner. He has a 6-month-old son as well. And we're actually having quite a baby boom at the company as well because our median age is 32, and so as the company has aged, believe it or not, that's actually older than it used to be. People are having more kids, and so just the lifestyle of switching from startup to more of a sustainable enterprise is something we talk about constantly and need to talk about constantly and help people adjust and adapt to it. And where it's like, guys, it's not all about heroics all the time now because the cost of failure is different than it was before, when we were spending other people's money. And, but transitioning that we will do anything to conquer the universe attitude is, for everybody else as we continue to scale is important. And I think it relates to talking about things and setting the example and making sure leaders are focusing on sustainable practices, which actually, again, to put a plug in for Agile, I think is one of the best, most important innovations that Agile can do because you're forced to make trade-offs all the time in resource allocation decisions, and you're not going to get everything you want, and that's really important.
Okay, well, we're going to end there, and we're going to do a very quick swap. Don't leave the room. Andrew Hill is going to bring his panel up. But for the moment, please join me in thanking these wonderful panelists.